Good evening, good evening and welcome back to my channel. I am the Loyal Hufflepuff, and today we will continue our reading in Siege and Storm. This is the second book of the trilogy titled Shadow and Bone, and there is currently a second season of Shadow and Bone on there, and I am looking forward to seeing that. I know it's been some time since we've posted last. I have myself been busy with a lot of stuff. VBS, end of school year, starting work. Well, work has already been started, in-laws moving in. But anywho, we're trying this new routine, see if this all works out, and hopefully you guys like this new scenery. We might be doing this every so often. Sorry about that. We might be doing this every so often to, change of scenery, change of pace, and we'll see how it goes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and continue our reading in Siege and Storm. If you all can hear me, please comment down below. If you can hear me, please comment down below. I want to make sure I'm being heard loud and clear. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. David had managed to slip away again after the last council meeting, and it was late the following evening before I had a free moment to corner him in the fabricator workrooms. I found him hunched over a pile of blueprints, his fingers stained with ink. I settled myself on a stool beside him and cleared my throat. He looked up, blinking owlishly. He was so pale I could see the blue tracery of veins through his skin, and someone had given him a very bad haircut. Probably did it himself, I thought with an inward shake of my head. It was hard to believe that this was the boy Ginya had fallen so hard for. His eyes flicked to the collar at my neck. He began to fidget with the items on his work table, moving them around and arranging them in careful lines. A compass, graphite pencils, pens and pots of ink in different colors, pieces of clear and mirrored glass, a hard-boiled egg that I assumed was his dinner, and page after page of drawings and plans that I couldn't begin to make sense of. "What are you working on?" I asked. He blinked again. "Dishes." "Ah. Reflective bowls," he said, "based on parabola." "How interesting," I managed. He scratched his nose, leaving a giant blue smudge along the ridge. "It might be a way to magnify your power." "Like the mirrors in my gloves?" I'd asked. That the Durists remake them. With the power of 2 amplifiers, I probably didn't need them. But the mirrors allowed me to focus and pinpoint light, and there was something comforting in the control they gave me. "Sort of," said David. "If I get it right, it will be a much bigger way to use the cut. And if you get it wrong, either nothing will happen, or whoever's operating it will be blown to bits." "Sounds promising." "I thought so too," he said without a hint of humor, and bent back to his work. "David," I said. He looked up and startled, as if he'd completely forgotten I was there. "I need to ask you something." His gaze darted to the collar again, and then back to his work table. "What can you tell me about Ila Morozova?" David twitched, glancing around the nearly empty room. Most of the fabricators were still at dinner. He was clearly nervous, maybe even frightened. He looked at the table, picked up his compass, put it down. Finally he whispered, "They called him the Bonesmith." A quiver passed through me. I thought of the fingers and vertebra lying on the peddlers' tables in Kribursk. "Why?" I asked. "Because of the amplifiers he discovered?" David looked up, surprised. "He didn't find them. He made them." I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. "Murzost?" He nodded. So that was why David had looked at Morzova's collar when Zoya asked if any Grisha had ever had such power. Morozova had been playing with the same forces as the Darkling. Magic. Ambition. How? I asked. No one knows, David said, glancing over his shoulder again. After the Black Heretic was killed in the accident that created the Fold, his son came out of hiding to take control of the Second Army. He had all of Morozova's journals destroyed. His son? Again, I was faced with the knowledge of how few people knew the Darkling's secret. The Black Heretic had never died. There had only ever been one Darkling, a single powerful Grisha who had ruled the Second Army for generations, hiding his true identity. As far as I knew, he'd never had a son, and there was no way he would destroy something as valuable as Morozova's journals. Aboard the whaler, he'd said not all the books prohibited the combination of amplifiers. Maybe he'd been referring to Morozova's own writings. Why was his son hiding? I asked, curious as to how the Darkling had managed to frame such a deception. This time David frowned as if the answer were obvious. A Darkling and his heir never live at the little palace at the same time. The risk of assassination is too great. I see, I said. Plausible enough, and after hundreds of years, I doubted anyone would question such a story. The Grisha did love their traditions, and Genya couldn't have been the first tailor of the Darkling had kept in his employ. Why would he have had the journals destroyed? They documented Morozova's experiments with amplifiers. The Black Heretic was trying to recreate those experiments when something went wrong. The hair rose on my arms, and the result was the Fold. David nodded. His son had all of Morozova's journals and papers burned. He said they were too dangerous, too much of a temptation to any Grisha. That's why I didn't say anything at the meeting. I shouldn't even know they ever existed. So how do you? David looked around the almost empty workshop again. Morozova was a fabricator, maybe the first, certainly the most powerful. He did things that no one's ever dreamed of before or since. He gave a sheepish shrug. To us, he's kind of a hero. Do you know anything else about the amplifiers he created? David shook his head. There were rumors of others, but the stag was the only one I'd ever heard of. It was possible David had never even seen the Istori Sankya. The apparat had claimed that the book was once given to all Grisha children when they arrived at the little palace. But that was long ago. The Grisha put their faith in the small science, and I'd never known them to bother with religion. Superstition, the Darkling had called the Red Book. Peasant propaganda. Clearly, David hadn't made the connection between Sankta Ilya and Ilya Morozova. He had something to hide. David, I said, why are you here? You fashioned the collar. You must have known what he intended. He swallowed. I knew he would be able to control you, that the collar would allow him to use your power. But I never believed all those people. He struggled to find the words. Finally, he held out his ink-stained hands and said, almost pleadingly, I make things. I don't destroy them. I wanted to believe that he had underestimated the Darkling's ruthlessness. I'd certainly made the same mistake, but he might be lying and he might just be weak. Which is worse? Asked a harsh voice in my head. If he can change sides once, he can do it again. Was it Nikolai's voice? The Darklings? Or was it just part of me that had learned to trust no one? Good luck with the dishes, I said as I rose to leave. David hunched over his papers. I don't believe in luck. Too bad, I thought. We're going to need some. I went straight from the fabricator workrooms to the library and spent most of the night there. It was an exercise in frustration. The Grisha histories I searched had only the most basic information. Ilya Morozova, Despite the fact that he was considered the greatest fabricator who ever lived, he had invented the Grecian steel, a method of making unbreakable glass, and a compound for liquid fire so dangerous that he destroyed the formula just 12 hours after he created it. But any mentions of amplifiers or the bonesmith had been expunged. That didn't stop me from returning the next evening to bury myself in religious texts and any reference I could find in St. Elia. Like most saints' tales, the story was martyrdom of his martyrdom was depressingly brutal. One day, a plow had overturned in the fields behind his home. Hearing the screams, Ilya ran to help, only to find a man weeping over his dead son. The boy's body torn open by the blades, the ground soaked through his blood. Ilya had brought the boy back to life, and the villagers had thanked him for it by clapping him in irons and tossing him into a river to sink beneath the weight of his chains. The details were hopelessly muddy. Sometimes Ilya was a farmer, sometimes a mason, or a woodworker. He had 2 daughters, or 1 son, or no children at all. 100 different villages claimed to be the site of his martyrdom. Then there was a small problem of the miracle he'd performed. I had no problem believing that Saint Ilya might be a corporalnik healer, but Ilya Morozova was supposed to be a fabricator. What if they weren't the same person at all? At night, the glass-domed room was lit by oil lamps, and the hush was so deep that I could hear myself breathe. Alone in the gloom, surrounded by books, it was hard not to feel overwhelmed. But the library seemed like my best hope, so I kept at it. Tulia found me there one evening, curled up in my favorite chair, struggling to make sense of a text in ancient Ravkan. "You shouldn't come here at night without one of us," he said grumpily. I yawned and stretched. I was probably more in danger of a shelf falling on me than anything else, but I was tired to argue. "Won't happen again," I said. "What is that?" Tulia asked. Excuse me. "What is that?" Tulia asked, lowering himself down to get a closer view of the book in my lap. He was so huge that it was a bit like having a bear join me for a study session. "I'm not sure. I saw the name Ilya in the index, so I picked it up, but I can't make sense of it." "It's a list of titles." "You can read it?" I asked in surprise. "We were raised in the church," he said, skimming the page. I looked at him. Lots of children were raised in religious homes, but that didn't mean they could read liturgical Ravkan. "What does it say?" He ran a finger down the words beneath Ilya's name. His huge hands were covered in scars. Beneath his rough-spun sleeve, I could see the edge of a tattoo peeking out. "Not much," he said. "Saint Ilya the beloved. Saint Ilya the treasured. There are a few towns listed, though, places where he's said to have performed miracles." I sat up straighter. "That might be a place to start." "You should explore the chapel. I think there are some books in the vestry." I had walked past the royal chapel plenty of times, but I'd never been inside. I'd always thought of it as the apparat's domain, and even with him gone, I wasn't sure I wanted to visit. "What's it like?" Tulia lifted his huge shoulders. "Like a chapel." "Tulia," I asked, suddenly curious, did you ever even consider joining the Second Army?" He looked offended. I wasn't born to serve the Darkling. I wanted to ask what he had been born for, but he tapped the page and said, "I can translate this for you." "If you like," he grinned, "or maybe I'll just make Tamar do it." "All right," I said, "thanks." He bent his head. It was just a bow, but he was still kneeling beside me, and there was something about his pose that sent a shiver up my spine. I felt as if he were waiting for something. Tentatively, I reached out and laid a hand on his shoulder. As soon as my fingers came to rest, he let out a breath. It was almost a sigh. We stayed there for a moment, silent in the halo of lamplight. Then he rose and bowed again. I'll be just outside the door. I'll be just outside the door, he said and slipped away into the dark. Maul returned from the hunt the next morning, and I was eager to tell him everything. What I'd learned from David, the plans for the new hummingbird, my strange encounter with Tolia. He's an odd one, Maul agreed, but it still couldn't hurt to check out the chapel. We decided to walk over together, and on the way I pressed him to tell me about the hunt. We spent more time every day playing cards and drinking kvass than doing anything else. And some dude got so drunk he passed out in the river. He almost drowned. His servants hauled him out by his boots, but he kept wading back in, slurring something about the best way to catch trout. What was it terrible? I asked, laughing. It was fine. He kicked a pebble down the path with his boot. There's a lot of curiosity about you. Why do I doubt I'm going to like any of this? One of the royal trackers is sure your powers are fake. And just how would I manage that? I believe there's an elaborate system of mirrors, pulleys, and possibly hypnotism involved. I got a little lost. I started to giggle. It wasn't all funny, Alina. When they were in their cups, some of the nobles made it clear they think all of the Grisha should be rounded up and executed. Saints, I breathed. They're scared. That's no excuse, I said, feeling my anger rise. We're Rovkins, too. It's like they forget everything the Second Army has done for them. Maul raised his hands. I didn't say I agree with them. I sighed and swatted at an innocent tree branch. I know. Anyway, I think I made a bit of progress. How did you manage that? Well, they liked that you served the First Army and that you saved their prince's life. After he risked his own life rescuing us? I may have taken some liberties with the details. Oh, Nikolai will love that. Is there more? I told them you hate herring. Why? And that you love plum cake, and that Anakuya took a switch to you when you ruined your spring slippers jumping in puddles. I winced. Why would you tell them all that? I wanted to make you human, he said. All they see when they look at you is the Sun Summoner. They see a threat, another powerful Grisha like the Darkling. I want them to see a daughter or a sister or a friend. I want them to see Alina. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Do you practice being wonderful? Daily, he said with a grin. Then he winked. But I prefer useful. The chapel was the only remaining building of a monastery that had once stood atop Os Alta, and it was said to be where the first kings of Ravka had been crowned, compared to the other structures on the palace grounds. It was a humble building, with whitewashed walls and a single bright blue dome. It was empty and looked like it could use a good cleaning. The pews were covered in dust, and there were pigeons roosting in the eaves. As we walked up the aisle, Maul took my hand, and my heart gave a funny little leap. We didn't waste much time in the vestry. The few books on its shelves were a disappointment, just a bunch of old hymnals with crumbling yellowed pages. The only thing of real interest in the chapel was the massive triptych behind the altar. A riot of color, its 3 huge panels showed 13 saints with benevolent faces. I recognized some of them from the Histori Sanctia. Elisabetta with her bloody roses. Peter with his still burning arrows. And there was Saint Ilya with his collar and fetters and broken chains. No animals, Maul observed. From what I've seen, he's never pictured with the amplifiers, just with the chains, except in Histori Sanctia. I just didn't know why. Most of the triptych was in fairly good condition, but Ilya's panel had sustained bad water damage. The saints' faces were barely visible under the mold, and the damp smell of mildew was nearly overpowering. I pressed my nose to my sleeve. There must be a leak somewhere, said Maul. This place is a mess. My eyes traced the shape of Ilya's face beneath the grime. Another dead end. I didn't like to admit it, but I'd gotten my hopes up. Again, I sensed that pull, that emptiness at my wrist. Where was the Firebird? We can stand here all day, Maul said, but he's not going to start talking. I knew he was teasing, but I felt a prickle of anger, though I wasn't sure if it was at him or myself. He turned to go back down the aisle, and I stopped short. The Darkling was waiting in the gloom by the entrance, seated in a shadowy pew. What is it? Maul asked, following my gaze. I waited, perfectly still. See him, I begged silently. Please see him. Alina, is something wrong? I dug my fingers into my palm. No, I said. Do you think we should check the vestry again? It didn't seem very promising. I made myself smile and walk. You're probably right. Wishful thinking. As we passed by the Darkling, he turned his head to watch us. He pressed a finger to his lips, then bent his head in a mocking imitation of prayer. I felt better when we were out in the fresh air, away from the moldy smell of the chapel. But my mind was racing. It had happened again. The Darkling's face had been unscarred. Maul hadn't seen him. That must mean it wasn't real, just some kind of vision. But he touched me that night in his rooms. I'd felt his fingers on my cheek. What kind of hallucination could do that? I shivered as we passed into the woods. Was this some manifestation of the Darkling's new powers? I was terrified by the prospect that he might have somehow found a way into my thoughts, but the other possibility was far worse. You cannot violate the rules of this world without a price. I pressed my arm to my side, feeling the sea-whipped scales chafe against my skin. Forget Morozova and his madness. Maybe this had nothing to do with the Darkling at all. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Maul, I began, not certain what I intended to say. The third amp, he put a finger to his lips, and the gesture was so like the Darkling's that I nearly stumbled. But in the next second, I heard rustling and Vasily emerged from the trees. I wasn't used to seeing the prince anywhere except the Grand Palace, and for a moment I just stood there. Then I recovered from my surprise and bowed. Vasily acknowledged me with a nod, ignoring Maul completely. Moise Zarevich, I said in greeting. Alina Starkov, the prince replied with a smile. I hope you'll grant me a moment of your time. Of course, I replied. I'll be right down the path, Maul said, shooting Vasily a suspicious glare. The prince watched him go. The deserter hasn't quite learned his place, has he? Come on. There we go. Yeah. I bit down on my anger. What can I do for you, Moise Zarevich? Please, he said. I prefer you call me Vasily, at least when we are in private. I blinked. I'd never been alone with the prince before, and I didn't want to be now. How are you settling in at the little palace? He asked. Very well, thank you, Moise Zarevich. Vasily. I don't know that it's appropriate to speak to you so informally, I said primly. You call my brother by his given name. I met him under unique circumstances. I know he can be very charming, Vasily said, but you should know that he's also very deceptive and very clever. That's certainly true, I thought, but all I said was, he has an unusual mind. Vasily chortled. What a diplomat you've become. You've a most refreshing way about it. Given time, I have no doubt that, despite your humblest antecedents, you will learn to conduct yourself with the restraint and elegance of a noblewoman. You mean I'll learn to shut up? Vasily gave a disapproving sniff. I needed to get out of this conversation before I really offended him. Vasily might seem a fool, but he was still a prince. Indeed, no, he said with a stilted laugh. You have a delightful candor. Thank you, I mumbled. If you'll excuse me, Your Highness. Vasily stepped into my path. I don't know what arrangement you've made with my brother, but you must realize that he's a second son. Whatever his ambitions, that's all he ever will be. Only I can make you queen. There it was. I heaved an internal sigh. Only a king can make a queen, I reminded him. Vasily waved this talk away. My father won't live much longer. I as good as rule Ravka now. Is that what you call it? I thought with a surge of irritation. I doubted Vasily would be in Oz Alta if Nikolai didn't present a threat to his crown, but this time I held my tongue. You've risen high for a Karamzin orphan, he went on, but you might rise higher still. I can assure you, Moisevich, I said with complete honesty, I have no such ambitions. Then what do you want, Sun Summoner? Right now, I like to go have my lunch. His lower lip jutted out sulkily, and for a moment he looked just like his father. Then he smiled. You're a smart girl, he said, and I think you'll prove a useful one. I look forward to deepening our acquaintance. I would like nothing better, I lied. He took my hand and pressed his moist mouth to my knuckles. Until then, Alina Starkov. I stifled a gag as he strode off. I wiped my hand superstitiously on my kefta. Maul was waiting for me at the edge of the woods. What was that about? He asked, his face worried. Oh, you know, I replied. Another prince, another proposal. You can't be serious, Maul said with a disbelieving laugh. He doesn't waste any time. My power is alliance, I intoned, imitating Nikolai. Should I offer my facilitations? Maul asked, but there was no edge to his voice, only amusement. Apparently, the heir to the throne of Ravka wasn't quite as threatening as an overconfident privateer. Do you think the Darkling had to deal with unwanted advances from wet-lipped royals? I asked glumly. Maul snickered. What's so funny? I just pictured the Darkling being cornered by a sweaty duchess trying to have her way with him. I snorted, and then I started to laugh outright. Nikolai and Vasily were so different. It was hard to believe they shared any blood at all. Unbidden, I remembered Nikolai's kiss, the rough feel of his mouth on mine as he'd held me to him. I shook my head. They may be different, I reminded myself as we headed into the palace. But they both want to use you just the same. End of chapter 16. And let me just take a quick look at this. Let's see. Yeah, there's 18 pages of this one. Yeah, we'll go ahead and read. Let's see, that was chapter 16. Yeah, we'll read chapter 17. Yeah, we'll read chapter 17. It's not a long chapter. Summer deepened, bringing waves of balmy heat to Al's Alta. The only relief to be found was in the lake or in the cold pools of the banya that lay in the dark shade of the birchwood grove beside the little palace. Whatever hostility the Ravkan court felt toward the Grisha, it didn't stop them from beckoning squallers and tide makers to the grand palace to summon breezes and fashion massive blocks of ice to cool the stuffy rooms. It was hardly a worthy use of Grisha talent, but I was eager to keep the king and queen happy, and I'd already deprived them of several much-valued fabricators, who were hard at work on David's mysterious mirrored dishes. Every morning I met with my Grisha council, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for hours, to discuss intelligence reports, troop movements, and what we were hearing from the northern and southern borders. Nikolai was still hoped to take the fight to the Darkling before he'd assembled the full strength of his shadow army. But so far, Ravka's network of spies and informants had been unable to discover his location. It was looking more and more likely that he'd have to make our stand in Oz Alta. Our only advantage was that the Darkling couldn't simply send the Nishvoya against us. He had to stay close to his creatures, and that meant he would have to march to the capital with them. The big question was whether he would enter Ravka from Ferda or from the Shuhan. Standing in the war room before the Grisha Council, Nikolai gestured to one of the massive maps along the wall. We took back most of this territory in the last campaign, he said, pointing to Ravka's northern border with Ferda. It's dense forest almost impossible to cross when the rivers aren't frozen, and all the access roads have been blockaded. Are the Grishas stationed there? Asked Zoya. No, Nikolai said, but there are lots of scouts based out of Ulensk. But he comes that way. He'll have plenty of warning. And he would have to deal with the Petrozoi, said Paja. Whether he goes over or around them, it'll buy us more time. She'd come into her own over the last few weeks. Though David remained silent and fidgety, she actually seemed glad to have time from the workrooms. I'm more concerned with the permafrost, Nikolai said, running his hand along the stretch of border that ran above Siberia. It's heavily fortified, but that's a lot of territory to cover. I nodded. Maul and I had once walked those wildlands together, and I remembered how vast they'd felt. I caught myself looking around the room, seeking him out, even though I knew he'd gone on another hunt, this time with a group of Kirch marksmen and Ravkan diplomats. And if he comes from the south? Asked Zoya. Nikolai signaled Fedor, who rose and began to walk with the Grisha through the weak points of the southern border. Because he'd been stationed at Sikursk, the Kropelnik knew the area well. It's almost impossible to patrol all the mountain passes coming out of the Sikurzoi, he observed grimly. True raiding parties have been taking advantage of that fact for years. It would be easy enough for the Darkling to slip through. Then it's the straight march to Oz Alta, said Sergei. Past the military base at Poliznaya, Past the military base at Poliznaya, Nikolai noted. That could work to our advantage. Either way, when he marches, we'll be ready. Ready? Pavel snorted. For any army of indestructible monsters? They're not indestructible, Nikolai said, nodding to me. And the Darkling isn't either. I know. I shot him. Zoya's eyes widened. You shot him? Yes, he said. Unfortunately, I didn't do a very good job of it. I'm not sure I'll improve with practice. He surveyed the Grisha. Looking into each worried face, he spoke again. The Darkling is powerful, so are we. But so are we. He's never faced the might of the First and Second Armies working in tandem, or the kinds of weapons I intend to supply. We face him. We flank him. We see which bullet gets lucky. While the Darkling Shadow horde was focused on the little palace, he would be vulnerable. Small, heavily armed units of Grecian soldiers would be stationed at 2-mile intervals around the capital. Once the fighting began, they would close on the Darkling and unleash all the firepower that Nikolai could muster. In a way, it was what the Darkling had always feared. Again, I remembered how he described the new weaponry being created beyond Ravka's borders, and what he said to me so long ago, beneath the caved-in roof of an old barn. The age of Grisha power is coming to an end. Pasha cleared her throat. Do we know what happens to the shadow soldiers when we kill the Darkling? I wanted to hug her. I didn't know what might happen to the Nishvoya. If we managed to put the Darkling down, they might vanish to nothing, and they might go into a mad frenzy or worse. But Sheeds said it. When we kill the Darkling. Tentative, frightened, but it still sounded suspiciously like hope. We focused the majority of our efforts on Alta's defense. The city had an ancient system of warning bells to alert the palace when the enemy was in sight. With his father's permission, Nikolai had installed heavy guns, like those on the Hummingbird above the city and palace walls. Despite Grisha grumbling, I'd had several placed on the roof of the little palace. They might not stop the Nishvoya, but they would slow them. Tentatively, the other Grisha had begun to open up to the Valley of the Fabricators. With help from the Inferni, the Metrolki were trying to create Grenakti that might produce a powerful enough flash of light to stall or stun the shadow soldiers. The problem was doing it without using blasting powders that would level everyone and everything around them. I sometimes worried that they might blow up the entire little palace and do the Darkling's work for him. More than once, I saw Grisha in the dining hall with burnt cuffs or singed brows. I encouraged him to try the more dangerous work by the lakeside with tidemakers on hand in case of emergency. Nikolai was intrigued enough by the project that he insisted on getting involved in the design. The fabricators tried to ignore him, then pretended to indulge him, but they quickly learned that Nikolai was more than a bored prince who liked to dabble. Not only did he understand David's ideas, he'd worked long enough with the rogue Grisha that he slipped easily into the language of the small science. Soon, they seemed to forget his rank and his Oxasia status, and he could often be found hunched over a table in the Metrolki workshops. I was disturbed by the experiments taking place behind the red lacquered doors of the Koprolki anatomy rooms, where they were collaborating with the fabricators to try to fuse Grisha steel with human bone. The idea was to make it possible for a soldier to withstand Nishvoya attack, but the process was painful and imperfect, and often the metal was simply rejected by the subject's body. The healers did what they could, but the ragged screams of First Army volunteers could sometimes be heard echoing through the halls of the little palace. Afternoons were taken up by endless meetings at the Grand Palace. The Sun Summoner's power was a valuable bartering chip in Ravka's attempts to forge alliances with other countries, and I was frequently asked to put in appearances at diplomatic gatherings to demonstrate my power and prove that I was, in fact, alive. The Queen hosted teas and dinners where I was paraded out to perform. Nikolai often dropped by to dole out compliments, flirt shamelessly, and hover protectively by my chair like a doting suitor. But nothing was as tedious as the strategy sessions. With the king's advisors and commanders, the king rarely attended. He preferred to spend his days hobbling after serving maids and sleeping in the sun like an old tomcat. In his absence, his counselors talked in endless circles. They argued that we should make peace with the Darkling, and that we should go to war with the Darkling. They argued for allying with the Shu, then for partnering with Ferda. They argued every line of every budget, from quantities of ammunition to what the troops ate for breakfast. And yet it was rare that anything got done or decided. When Vasily learned that Nikolai and I were attending the meetings, he put aside years of ignoring his duties as the Latsov heir and insisted on being there as well. To my surprise, Nikolai welcomed him enthusiastically. "What a relief," he said. "Please tell me you can make sense of these." He shoved a towering stack of ledgers across the table. "What is this?" Vasily asked. "A proposal for repairs to an aqueduct outside of Chernitsyn." "All this for an aqueduct?" "Don't worry, said Nikolai. "I'll have the rest delivered to your room." "There's more? Can't one of the ministers—" "You saw what happened when our father let others take over the business of ruling Ravka. We must remain vigilant." Warily, Vasily lifted the topmost paper from the pile as if he were picking up a soiled rag. It took everything in me not to burst out laughing. Vasily thinks he can lead as our father did, Nikolai confided to me that afternoon. Throwing banquets, giving the occasional speech. I'm going to make sure he knows just what it means to rule without the Darkling or the apparat there to take the reins. It seemed like a good enough plan, but before long I was cursing both princes beneath my breath. Vasily's presence ensured that meetings ran twice as long. He postured and preened, weighed in on every issue, held forth at length on patriotism, strategy, and finer points of diplomacy. I've never met a man who can say so much without saying anything at all. I fumed as Nikolai walked me back to the little palace after a particularly wretched session. There's got to be something you can do. Like what? Get one of those his prize ponies to kick him in the head. I'm sure they're frequently tempted, Nikolai said. Vasily's lazy and vain, and he likes to take shortcuts. But there's no easy way to govern a country. Trust me, he'll tire of it all soon enough. Maybe, I said, but I'll probably die of boredom before he does. Nikolai laughed. Next time, bring a flask. Every time he changes his mind, take a sip. I groaned. I'd be passed out on the floor before the hour was up. With Nikolai's help, I brought in armaments experts from Plazania to help familiarize the Grisha with modern weaponry and give them training in firearms. Though the sessions had started out tensely, they seemed to be going more smoothly now, and we hoped that a few friendships might be forming between the First and Second Armies. The units of Grecian soldiers who had been assembled to hunt down the Darkling when he approached Alta made the fastest progress. They returned from training missions full of private jokes and new camaraderie. They even took to calling each other Nolniki, Zeros, because they were no longer strictly First or Second Army. I'd been worried about how Botkin might respond to all the changes, but the man seemed to have a gift for killing, no matter the method, and he delighted in any excuse to spend time talking weaponry with Tolya and Timur. Because the Shu had a bad habit of taking a scalpel to their Grisha, few survived to make it into the ranks of the Second Army. Botkin loved being able to speak in his native tongue, but he also loved the twins' ferocity. They didn't rely only on their corporalky abilities the way Grisha raised at the little palace intended to. Instead, heart-rending was just one more weapon in their impressive arsenal. Dangerous boy, dangerous girl, Botkin commented, watching the twins spar with a group of corporalky one morning while a clutch of nervous summoners waited their turn. Marie and Sergei were there, Nadia trailing behind them as always. Chief! Wolf! Then he complained Sergei. Tamar had split his lip open, and he was having trouble talking. I feel sorry for her husband. We'll not marry, said Botkin as Tamar threw a hapless infirmity to the ground. Why not? I asked, surprised. Not her. Not brother either, said the mercenary. They are like Botkin, born for battle, made for war. 3 corporalky hurled themselves at Tolya. In moments, they were all moaning on the floor. I thought of what Tolya had said in the library, that he wasn't born to serve the Darkling, like so many Shu, he'd taken the path of the soldier for hire, traveling the world as a mercenary and a privateer. But he'd ended up at the little palace anyway. How long would he and his sister stay? I like her, said Nadia, looking wistfully at Tamar. She's fearless. Botkin laughed. Fearless is other word for stupid. I wouldn't say that to her faith, grumbled Sergei as Marie dabbed his lip with a damp cloth. I found myself starting to smile and turned aside. I hadn't forgotten the way the three of them had welcomed me to the little palace. They hadn't been the ones to call me a whore or try to throw me out, but they certainly hadn't spoken up to defend me, and the idea of pretending friendship was just a little too much. Besides, I didn't quite know how to behave around them. We'd never been truly close, and our difference in status felt like an unbridgeable gap. Genya wouldn't care, I thought suddenly. Genya had known me. She'd laughed with me and confided in me, and no shiny kifta or title would have kept her from telling me exactly what she thought or slipping her arm through mine to share a bit of gossip. Despite the lies she told, I missed her. As if in answer to my thoughts, I felt a tug on my sleeve, and a tremulous voice said, Moise Sauvigny. Nadia stood shifting from foot to foot. I hoped... What is it? She turned to a murky corner of the stables and gestured to a young boy in earthrelky blue, whom I'd never seen before. A few Grisha had begun to trickle in after we'd spent out the pardon, but this boy looked too young to have served in the field. He approached nervously, fingers twisting in his kefta. This is Adrik, Nadia said, placing her arm around him. My brother. The resemblance was there, though you had to look for it. We heard that you plan to evacuate the school. That's right. I was sending the students to the one place I knew with dormitories and space enough to house them. A place far from the fighting, Karamzin. Botkin would go with them too. I hated to lose such a capable soldier, but this way the younger Grisha would still be able to learn from him, and he'd be able to keep an eye on them. Since Bagra wouldn't see me, I'd send a servant to her with the same offer. She'd made no reply. Despite my best attempts to ignore her slights, the repeated rejection still stung. You're a student? I asked Adrik, pushing thoughts of Bagra from my mind. He nodded once, and I noted the determined thrust to his chin. Adrik was wondering. We were wondering if... I want to stay, he said fiercely. My brows shot up. How old are you? Old enough to fight. He would have graduated this year, put in Nadia. I frowned. He was only a couple of years younger than I was, but he was all bony elbows and rumpled hair. Go with the others to Karamzin, I said. If you still want to, you can join us in a year. If we're still here. I'm good, he said. I'm a squaller, and I'm as strong as Nadia, even without an amplifier. It's too dangerous. This is my home. I'm not leaving. Adrik, Nadia chastised. It's okay, I said. Adrik seemed almost feverish. His hands were balled into fists. I looked at Nadia. You sure you want to stay? Began Adrik. I'm talking to your sister. If you fall to the Darkling's army, she's the one who will have to mourn you. Nadia paled slightly at that, but Adrik didn't flinch. I had to admit he had metal. He had metal. Nadia worried the inside of her lip, glancing from me to Adrik. If you're afraid to disappoint him, think of what it will be like to bury him, I said. I knew I was being harsh, but I wanted them both to understand. I wanted them both to understand what they were asking. She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. Let him fight, she said. I say he stays. If you send him away, he'll just be back at the gates a week from now. I sighed, then turned my attention back to Adrik, who was already grinning. Not a word to the other students, I said. I don't want them getting ideas. I jabbed a finger at Nadia. And he's your responsibility. Thank you, Moise Sauvigny, said Adrik, bowing so low I thought he might tip over. I was already regretting my decision. Get him back to classes. I watched them walk up the hill toward the lake. then dusted myself off and made my way to one of the smaller training rooms, where I found Maul sparring with Pavel. Maul had been at the little palace less and less lately. The invitations had started arriving the afternoon. He returned from Balakriv, hunts, house parties, trout fishing, card games. Every nobleman and officer seemed to want Maul at his next event. Sometimes he was just gone for an afternoon, sometimes for a few days. It reminded me of being back at Kramzin, when I would watch him right away and then wait each day at the kitchen window for him to return. But if I was honest with myself, the days when he was gone were almost easier when he was at the little palace. I felt guilty for not being able to spend more time with him. I hated the way the Grisha ignored him or talked down to him like a servant. As much as I missed him, I encouraged him to go. It's better this way, I told myself. Better he deserted to help me. Maul had been a tracker with a bright future, surrounded by friends and admirers. He didn't belong standing guard in doorways or lurking at the edges of rooms, playing the role of my dutiful shadow as I went from one meeting to the next. I could watch him all day, said a voice behind me. I stiffened. Zoya was standing there. Even in the heat, she never seemed to sweat. You don't think he stinks of Kramzin? I asked, remembering the vicious words she had once spoken to me. I find the lower classes have a certain rough appeal. You will let me know when you're through with him, won't you? I beg your pardon? Oh, I did misunderstand. Oh, did I misunderstand? You two seem so close. But I'm sure you're setting your sights higher these days. I turned on her. What are you doing here, Zoya? I came for a training session. You know what I am. What are you doing at the little palace? I'm a soldier of the Second Army. This is where I belong. I folded my arms. It was time Zoya and I had this out. You don't like me, and you've never missed an opportunity to let me know it. Why follow me now? What choice do I have? I'm sure the Darkling would gladly welcome you back at his side. Are you ordering me to leave? She was striving for her usual haughty tone, but I could tell she was scared. It gave me a guilty little thrill. I want to know why you're so determined to stay. Because I don't want to live in darkness, she said. Because you're our best chance. I shook my head. Too easy. She flushed. Am I supposed to beg? Would she? I found I didn't mind the idea. You're vain. You're ambitious. You would have done anything for the Darkling's attention. What changed? What changed? She choked out. Her lips thinned, and her fists clenched at her sides. I had an aunt who lived in Novogribirsk, a niece. The Darkling could have told me what he meant to do, if I could have warned them. Her voice broke, and I was instantly ashamed of the pleasure I'd felt at watching her squirm. Begra's voice echoed in my ears. You're taking to power well. As it grows, it will hunger for more. And yet, did I believe Zoya? Was the sheen in her eyes real or pretense? She blinked her tears back and glared at me. I still don't like you, Starkov. I never will. You're common and clumsy, and I don't know why you are born with such power. But you're the Sun Summoner, and if you keep Ravka free, then I'll fight for you. I watched her, noting the two bright spots of color that flamed high on her cheeks, the trembling on her lip. Well, she said, and I could see how much it cost her to ask, are you sending me away? I waited a moment longer. You can stay, I said, for now. Is everything all right? Maul asked. He hadn't even noticed that he'd left off sparring. In an instant, Zoya's uncertainty was gone. She gave him a dazzling smile. I hear you're quite the marvel with a bow and arrow. I thought you might offer me a lesson. Maul glanced from Zoya back to me. Maybe later. I look forward to it, she said, and swept away in a soft rustle of silk. What was that about? He asked, as we began to walk up the hill to the little palace. I don't trust her. For a long minute, he said nothing. Alina, Maul began uneasily. What happened in Kribersk? I cut him off quickly. I didn't want to know what he might have done with Zoya back at the Grisha camp. And that was hardly the point. She was one of the Darkling's favorites, and she always hated me. She was probably jealous of you. She broke 2 of my ribs. So, she what? It was an accident, sort of. I never told Maul exactly how bad it had been for me before I learned to use my power. The endless, lonely days of failure. I just can't be sure where her real allegiance lies. I rubbed the back of my neck where the muscles had started to bunch. I can't be sure of anyone. Not the Grisha, not the servants. Any of them could be working for the Darkling. Maul looked around. For once, nobody seemed to be watching. Impulsively, he seized hold of my hand. Gritsky's throwing a fortune-telling party in the upper town 2 days from now. Come with me. Gritsky? His father is Stepan Gritsky, the Pickle King. New money, Maul said in a very good imitation of a smug noble. But his family has a palace down by the canal. I can't, I said, thinking of the meetings, David's mirrored dishes, the evacuation of the school. It just felt wrong to go to a party when we could be at war in a matter of days or weeks. You can, said Maul, just for an hour or 2. It was so tempting to steal a few moments with Maul away from the pressures of the little palace. He must have sensed that I was wavering. We'll dress you up as one of the performers, he said. No one will even know the Sun Summoner is there. A party late in the evening, after the day's work was done. I missed one night of futile searching through the library. What was the harm in that? All right, I said, let's go. His face broke into a grin that left me breathless. I didn't know if I'd ever get used to the idea that a smile like that might actually be for me. Tully and Timar won't like it, he warned. They're my guards. They follow my orders. Maul snapped to attention and swept me in elaborate bow. Da, moi sir sovereignty, he pronounced in somber tones. We live to serve. I rolled my eyes, but as I hurried to the Motralki working rooms, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. And that was the end of chapter 17. I hope you all enjoyed this part. Like I said, I know it's been a while since I've been reading, but routines are changing, and I'm trying to get back to routine of reading this book. In the coming weeks, maybe months, depending on when we get all this done, I'm going to be giving you guys a heads up. I'm going to be changing to the name of my YouTube channel. I'm not sure what it's going to be called at this point, but I'm going to be looking into it and seeing which one would fit best with where we're at with this. I want to make sure you guys find my videos easier, because I know there's other names that have my name out there, and I want to be as unique as possible. So if you guys have any ideas about, if you guys are curious about what the name is, just mention it down below. If you guys are enjoying this book, and I am glad that you guys are supporting my channel, you guys are subscribing. That is a huge help with, it's been a huge help with you guys helping my channel, subscribing, liking, commenting. It's all been positive, and thank you so much for all your help, guys. We are, as last time I checked, we were nearing 200 subscribers. I'm hoping that we can get to that 200 mark, maybe even 250. Let your friends know, talk to people. I hope you all are enjoying this book, and I hope to see you all in the next video.